The Lionsgate Bridge was a parking lot that night, and the rain coming off the inlet was the kind that doesn't fall so much as hang in the air, soaking through your wool coat before you've made it from the car to the door. February in North Vancouver, my granddaughter's confirmation supper, and I was 38 minutes late. I'd phoned ahead from the lot at the church when I realized the bridge was backed up to the causeway. My daughter said, "Oh, Dad, no rush. We'll save you a plate." And her voice had that breezy quality I'd come to mistake for warmth over the past few years. I hung up and sat in the car a minute watching the wipers, thinking about how proud my wife would have been of Hazel today. 12 years old, hands folded, that little white dress. Margaret had been gone 4 years that month. I still bought 2 coffees some mornings before I caught myself. By the time I pulled onto my daughter's street in Lynn Valley, the rain had turned to that wet, heavy snow we get on the North Shore. The houses were lit up. Big front windows, kids' bikes propped against garages. I parked behind a black Audi. I didn't recognize the walkway up to the front porch had been salted, and I noticed because I'd been the one to bring her the bag of de-icer back in November. The cedar wreath on the door was the one I'd given her 2 Christmases ago. I had a gift bag in one hand, a little silver cross on a chain for Hazel Sterling from a jewelry's on Lonsdale. $85. Not much, but I'd had it engraved with her name and the date. The other hand held a bottle of Niagara Ice wine I'd been saving for something. I don't know what for, just saving it. The front door was unlocked. It usually was when company was over. I stepped into the entryway and stopped to take off my boots the way you do, and that's when I heard him. My son-in-law's voice carrying from the dining room. Honestly, I was praying he'd cancel. Every supper, it's the same lecture. The man cannot read a room to save his life. Laughter. Not polite laughter. The full loose kind. The kind you hear at a pub after the 3rd round. Then another voice I half recognized. One of his work friends saying, maybe he had a stroke on the bridge. More laughter. And then my daughter's voice. My Joanne. Don't even joke. Honestly, the day Dad finally checks out. I'm booking Maui. Laughing while she said it. Laughing the way she used to laugh when she was 9 and her mother would catch her trying to sneak the dog treats. I stood in the entryway with one boot on and one boot off, the gift bag in my hand, the bottle of ice wine in the other, and I listened to my daughter laugh about my death. I didn't move for what must have been 10 or 15 seconds. I could see myself in the hallway mirror, the gray hair, the rain on my shoulders, the stupid little gift bag with the tissue paper sticking out the top. I looked like a man who'd been hit, but hadn't fallen yet. I put my boot back on. I set the gift bag down on the bench by the door. Just set it down. Didn't drop it. Didn't make a sound. The ice wine I kept. I don't know why. I opened the door and I closed it behind me with the same care a person uses closing the door of a hospital room where someone is sleeping. I walked back to my car in the snow. I sat in the driver's seat for a long time before I turned the key. The dashboard clock said 7:23. The radio was tuned to CBC2, some kind of cello piece. I drove. I didn't go home. Home was where Margaret's chair still was. And I wasn't ready for that chair yet. I drove out to the C-bus terminal and parked and watched the lights of Vancouver across the water for I don't know how long. My phone rang twice. Joanne, I didn't answer. The 3rd time I shut it off. What I did instead was open my banking app, RBC. I'd been with them since 1978. I scrolled back through the transfers. $2,000 on the 1st of every month, every single month, going to Joanne and Trevor's joint account, labeled house help by my own hand. $24,000 a year, 5 years of it, since Martyr's diagnosis, when Joanne had cried on my kitchen floor and said they were going to lose the place if I couldn't help, just for a little while. Just until Trevor's promotion came through. The promotion had come through. 2 of them, in fact. He drove an Audi now. I drove a 2014 Subaru, $120,000. I sat in the parking lot at the C-bus terminal and looked at that number and tried to feel angry, but I couldn't. What I felt was something colder than that and quieter. The way you feel when a piece of equipment you've trusted for decades finally fails, and you stand there looking at it, and you understand that it isn't coming back. I drove to the Holiday Inn off Marine Drive. I didn't want to be in my own house that night. I paid for a room with my visa, lay on top of the bedspread without taking my coat off, and stared at the ceiling tiles until the heating unit clicked on. In the morning, I called Doug Forsythe. Doug had been my lawyer for 31 years. We'd gone to UBC together back when the law school was still in that ugly building, and he'd written Margaret's will and held my hand through probate. His secretary said he was booked solid, and I said, "Bev, it's Walter. Please tell him it's important." And she said, "Oh, honey, of course, hang on." He saw me at 10 o'clock. His office is in one of those glass towers downtown, 20th floor view of the harbor. He came out from behind the desk to shake my hand the way he always did, and then he took one look at my face and said, "Sit down. Tell me." I told him all of it slowly in order. The way you tell a doctor about your symptoms. The dinners over the past few years. The mortgage payments. The bottle of ice wine still sitting on the floor of my Subaru. The toast. Joanne's laugh. He didn't interrupt me. He took notes on a yellow legal pad, the same kind he'd used in 1992. When I finished, he set down the pen. "Walter," he said, "did you ever put the loan terms in writing?" I had. That was the thing. Doug himself had drafted it 5 years ago when I told him what I was about to do. A simple promissory note signed by both Joanne and Trevor acknowledging the funds as a loan repayable on demand. No interest, secured by the house. I'd nearly forgotten about it. I had filed it in the cabinet in my study and gone on with my life because she was my daughter, and you don't think about pieces of paper when it's your daughter. Doug went very still for a moment. Then he said, "Walter, I want you to be very sure about this. Once we send a demand letter, there is no quiet path back. Are you sure?" I thought about Hazel in her white dress that morning. I thought about the fact that I hadn't given her the cross. I thought about Margaret, who had been the one in our marriage who believed in second chances, and who would have wanted me to find a way through this without lawyers. And I thought about the way my daughter had left. "I'm sure," I said. The demand letter went out by registered post the following Monday. 45 days to repay $120,000 in full, or proceedings would commence in the BC Supreme Court. Doug's letter was brief and professional and devastating, the way the best legal writing is. He sent me a copy. I read it twice and put it in the cabinet beside the original promissory note. For 3 days, my phone was silent. Then it began. Joanne first. Voicemails. The tone shifted from confused to wounded to furious over the course of an afternoon. "Dad, what is this? Dad, we need to talk. Dad, are you actually doing this to us? Dad, this is insane. We're family." Then Trevor leaving a message in that smooth deal closing voice he used at his real estate firm. "Walter, mate, I think there's been a real misunderstanding here. Let's grab a coffee." I didn't answer any of them. Doug had been clear. All communication through his office. I sat in my kitchen drinking my 1 cup of decaf in the evening, the way Margaret and I always had, and I let the phone ring. What I did pick up on the 5th day was a call from my grandson, Eli, 21, in his 3rd year at SFU studying engineering. Joanne and Trevor's first child, born when Joanne was barely out of her own university. He was the reason I'd kept showing up to those Sunday suppers, if I'm honest. He looked like his grandmother around the eyes. "Granddad," he said. His voice was careful. "Mom told me what's happening. Are you okay?" I told him I was. I told him that what he was hearing from his mother was probably not the whole story, and that when he was ready to hear my version, I'd tell it to him plainly, but I wouldn't push. He was quiet for a long time on the line, and then he said, "Okay, Granddad, I'd like to hear it. Can I come over?" He came that Saturday. I made coffee, the proper kind, and we sat at the kitchen table where his grandmother used to roll up pie crust, and I told him everything. I didn't dress it up. I told him about the toast word for word. I told him about the money. I showed him the bank statements. He sat very still, hands wrapped around his mug. And when I finished, he said quietly, "I've heard them say things, Granddad, about you. I didn't know it was that bad." He told me his mother had started coloring her hair the same shade as a woman from her tennis club. He told me that Trevor had bought a boat last summer kept down at Granville Island that they hadn't told me about because his mom said, Granddad gets weird about money. I gets weird about money. I'd been writing them a check for $2,000 a month for 5 years. What can I do? Eli asked. I told him to do nothing, to live his life, to finish his degree. I told him I loved him and that whatever happened between me and his parents was not his to carry. He nodded, but I could see he was already carrying it. The first countermove came through their lawyer, a fellow named Ramsey out of a Yowtown firm. Doug knew him slightly. The letter argued that the funds had been gifts, that the promissory note had been signed under duress, that my late wife's illness had affected my judgment at the time of drafting, and that I was now possibly suffering from the early stages of cognitive decline. I read that letter 3 times, the cognitive decline part. My own daughter had told her lawyer that her father was losing his mind. Doug called me the same afternoon. Walter, I want you to do something for me. I want you to see Dr. Lonnie tomorrow if she can fit you in. I want a full cognitive assessment on the record. Dated. Signed. We get ahead of this now. I went the next morning. Dr. Lonnie had been my GP since Dr. Bowman retired. She walked me through the standard cognitive screening and a longer assessment. I scored 30 out of 30 on the MOSA. She wrote me a letter on her own letterhead attesting to my full mental competence as of that date, and she included a line off her own bat, noting that I had presented her concerns clearly, advocated articulately for myself, and demonstrated a level of executive function consistent with my long professional career. She knew. She didn't ask why I needed it. She knew. I drove home from her office and I sat in my driveway for a long time before going in. I thought about my daughter sitting across from her lawyer, deciding that the line of attack would be that her father was senile. 5 years of $2,000 checks, 12 years of birthday cards in my handwriting. And she had said, let's tell them he's losing it. Something in me that until that moment had still been wavering, still been wondering if I was doing the right thing, went quiet, settled like a stone dropping to the bottom of a pond. The second countermove came 2 weeks later, and it was uglier. A social worker from the Regional Health Authority showed up at my door on a Tuesday morning. A woman in her 50s, kind face, no nonsense, holding a clipboard. Someone, she said, had filed a concern under the Adult Guardianship Act. A welfare check. I invited her in. I made her tea. I gave her the letter from Dr. Lonnie before she'd asked a single question. I walked her through my finances, my medications, which were 1 statin and nothing else. My daily routine. I showed her my bookkeeping for the past 8 years, every receipt filed by month. I showed her the monthly volunteer schedule I kept at the Lionsgate Hospital gift shop, where I'd been working 2 mornings a week since Margaret died. I showed her the quarterly rebalancing spreadsheets I kept for my retirement portfolio, which generated last year just over $46,000 in dividends and interest, all of which I track myself. All of which my accountant signed off on but did not manage. She was there for 1 hour and 15 minutes. When she stood up to leave, she paused at the door and said, Mr. Howerin, I'll be closing this file today. I'll be very direct with you. Whoever filed this was not acting in good faith. I've seen this before. I'm sorry. I thanked her. I closed the door. I went to my study and I sat in Margaret's old chair, the one she used to read in, and I covered my face with my hands. That evening, Eli came over without being asked. He'd brought Tim Hortons. He sat across from me at the kitchen table and said, Granddad, they tried to have you declared incompetent. I know that's my mother. I know, son. He cried quietly at the kitchen table. I let him. I did not cry. I had cried out behind the wheel of the Subaru on the drive back from Doug's office the day we filed, and I had not cried since, and I would not cry again about this. Not because I was hard, but because some part of me had understood on the night of Hazel's confirmation that the daughter I'd been mourning had been gone for some years already. I had simply been late to notice. The case did not go to trial. It rarely does with documentation as clean as ours was. 6 months after the demand letter, in a mediated settlement at a conference room in Doug's office, Joanne and Trevor agreed to repay the full $120,000, plus my legal costs, plus interest at the prejudgment rate set by the court. The settlement was secured against the house in Lynn Valley. They had 90 days to refinance or sell. They could not refinance. Trevor's debt-to-income ratio, it turned out, was a disaster. The Audi was leased. The boat at Granville Island had been bought on a line of credit secured against the house I'd helped them keep. There was nothing left to borrow against. The house went up for sale in late summer. It sold in 11 days, well above asking, the way North Shore houses do. After the mortgage was discharged and my settlement was paid out and the realtor's commission and the legal fees, Joanne and Trevor walked away with about $30,000 between them. Trevor moved into a one-bedroom rental in Burnaby. Joanne took Hazel and moved into a townhouse in North Vancouver, paid for by a line of credit her mother-in-law co-signed. Eli stayed in his student housing. Their marriage did not survive. I learned this from Eli in pieces. Trevor had been gambling, mostly online sports books, mostly hidden. The boat was the tip of an iceberg. There had been a woman, too. Joanne filed for divorce in October. I did not feel triumphant about any of this. I want to be clear about that. There was no part of me that watched their lives come apart and thought, good. What I felt instead was a kind of dull surprise that the house of cards had been even flimsier than I'd thought. They had been pretending, all of them, while I had paid for the pretense. The day before the new owners were to take possession of the Lynn Valley house, Joanne called my landline. She had never called my landline in her life. I picked it up because I thought it might be the hospital gift shop about a shift change. Dad. Her voice was small. Can I come and see you? I almost said no. I almost said send a letter. But I am despite everything. Her father and Margaret was sitting in her chair in the photograph on the mantel watching me through the glass. Tomorrow, I said 3 o'clock the kitchen, not the living room. She came. She looked older. Not in the way that was satisfying to see. In the way that would have hurt her mother. She sat at the kitchen table where she'd done her homework as a girl and she cried and she apologized. The apology was long and detailed and it included words like devastated and ashamed and how could I and I don't recognize myself. I let her finish. I poured her a glass of water. I sat across from her and I said the thing I had been turning over my mind for months since the night at the C-bus terminal. Joanne, I am not going to forgive you today. I might eventually. I don't know yet. But I want you to understand something. And I want you to understand it clearly because I don't think you do. You did not lose this house because I was cruel. You lost it because you laughed at the idea of my death while you were living in the house I paid for. That is not punishment. That is the bill arriving. People are not infinite. They are not banks that smile when you withdraw from them. Your mother believed that family meant you owed each other patience. I believe that too. I still do. But patience is not the same as standing still while you're robbed. She was very quiet. Then she said, "What about Hazel?" I told her that Hazel was 12 and that I would be in Hazel's life for as long as Hazel wanted me there, on terms I would set with her directly when she was old enough to set them with me. That I would not use the child as a bargaining chip, and I expected the same of her, that the cross I'd had engraved on the night of the confirmation was in a drawer in my dresser, and it would be Hazel's whenever she wanted it, but I would give it to her myself. Joanne nodded. She left. I watched her go from the front window. She got into a Honda Civic that I assumed was a rental. That winter I did 3 things. I changed my will. The bulk of my estate, which is not enormous, but is more than people might guess, given that I'd been a structural engineer for 41 years, and Margaret had been frugal as the day is long, went in 3 parts. 40% to a foundation that supports widowed seniors in the Lower Mainland with elder advocacy and legal aid. 30% to Eli outright, no conditions, because that boy never took a thing he hadn't earned. 20% in trust for Hazel. Accessible at 25 with conditions tied to her completing post-secondary or trades training, and 10% to Joanne in a trust she could only access if she completed before my death a financial counseling program of my lawyer's choosing and 300 hours of documented volunteer work with a registered charity. If she did not, that 10% rolled into the foundation. It was not, I told Doug, a punishment. It was an invitation. The same invitation Margaret would have offered her in a softer voice. I am not as soft as her mother was. But I am not nothing either. The second thing I did was sell my own house in Deep Cove. It was too big for one man and a Subaru. I bought a 2-bedroom condo in Lonsdale with a den I made into a study and a balcony that faces the inlet so I can watch the sea buses cross at dusk. I gave most of Margaret's things to her sister in Kelowna, who cried on the phone and said she'd been hoping I would. The third thing I did was call Hazel. She was 13 by then. Joanne, to her credit, put her on the phone without trying to manage the call. I asked Hazel if she would like to come for lunch sometime, just the two of us, and she said yes very quietly. We went to a diner on Lonsdale. I gave her the cross. I told her the date was wrong now and that if she wanted, I'd have it re-engraved. She thought about it and said no, it was the date she'd been confirmed, and that was still true. I told her I was sorry I hadn't been there at the table that day. She told me she was glad I hadn't been. She'd heard later what they'd said. She'd been upstairs. We see each other now every other weekend. Eli usually comes too when his schedule allows. We don't talk about Joanne much. We don't have to. Hazel is going to be a paramedic. She tells me she has her grandmother's hands. I am 68 years old. I will tell you what I have learned, though no one is owed anyone's lessons. I have learned that when a person who is supposed to love you laughs at your absence, you are allowed to make your absence permanent in the parts of their life where they had expected your money. That is not revenge. That is honesty, applied retroactively. I have learned that the law used carefully by a person who has nothing to hide is one of the few mechanisms in this country that still treats a quiet old man and a smooth-talking son-in-law as equals in a room. Dud Forsythe and the yellow legal pad did more for my dignity than any speech I could have given at that dinner table. I have learned that the people who tell you that family is forever are usually trying to talk you into staying somewhere you've already left. And I have learned finally that a man can lose a daughter without losing a family. My grandson comes for supper on Sundays. My granddaughter calls me on Tuesday evenings after her piano lesson, Margaret's chair's in the new condo by the window, and on quiet nights I sit in the one across from it, and I tell her how the day went. She does not answer. But I have, I think, finally, after a long time of getting it wrong, started telling her the truth. The ice wine is still in the cabinet. I have not opened it. I am saving it for something. I no longer feel the need to know what. I sat in Margaret's chair the other evening, the one I moved to the new condo, and I thought about something my old foreman used to say on the job sites back in the 80s. He said, "A structure does not fail at the moment it falls. It fails years earlier in a weld nobody inspected in a tolerance somebody fudged because the deadline was tight. By the time it comes down, you were only watching the consequence of an old decision." That is what happened in our family. The night I stood in Joanne's entryway with one boot on and one boot off. The failure was not new. It had been quietly accumulating for years in every check I wrote without asking how it was being spent. In every Sunday supper where I let a comment slide because I did not want to be the difficult father. In every birthday where Trevor's smirk went unanswered. I taught them by my silence that I would absorb anything. And people will take whatever you teach them they could take. I do not say that to excuse what they did. Joanne made her own choices. Trevor made his. Hazel was upstairs and she heard the laughter and she knew even at 12 that something was wrong. The cause does not erase the choice, but it does explain why the bill when it finally arrived was so large. What I learned sitting at Doug Forsythe's conference table with the registered post receipt in my pocket is that dignity is a discipline, not a feeling. I did not feel dignified that morning. I felt sick to my stomach, but I had decided in the parking lot at the C-bus terminal the night before that I would behave as the man Margaret had married, not as the man my grief and my loneliness had let me become. The behavior came first. The feeling caught up months later slowly, the way warmth comes back into your hands after you have been out in the cold too long. I think about Eli sometimes. 21 years old, sitting at my kitchen table, crying because he had figured out who his mother was. He could have walked away from all of it, picked a side, gone quiet. He did not. He showed up. That is character. And characters built one decision at a time in rooms where nobody is watching. He learned more from his grandmother than from either of his parents, and she had been gone 4 years before he was old enough to understand what she had been teaching him. If I have anything to pass on to a person watching this, it is only this. Be patient with the people you love, because patience is the rent we pay for being alive together. But do not confuse patience with paralysis. When somebody shows you plainly who they are and what they think you are worth, believe them the first time, take notes, then decide with a steady hand what you are going to do about it. The law is a tool. Money is a tool. Silence, used carefully, is a tool. None of them are revenge. They are simply the means by which a quiet old man stays a